16.5 million people died in the First World War. To understand how a global catastrophe of that scale actually begins, we have to trace it all the way back to a single hyper-local event, a 19-year-old kid firing a pistol on a summer day. This map shows Europe in 1914. The continent was locked into two massive opposing alliance blocs. These countries were tied together by strict treaties, meaning if one nation went to war, the others were forced to follow. The trigger for those alliances was the man in this photograph. That's Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. In June of 1914, he was visiting the city of Sarajevo when his motorcade took a wrong turn. He ended up right in front of Gavrilo Princip, the young nationalist seen in this picture. Princip stepped up to the car and fired twice, killing both the Archduke and his wife. Because of the rigid treaties we just looked at, this assassination couldn't remain a local police matter. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, which pulled in Russia, which pulled in Germany, France, and eventually the world. Within weeks, millions of men were mobilized and marching to the front lines. Take a look at this invasion plan. Knowing they faced enemies on two sides, Germany's military commanders drafted a strategy to avoid a two-front war. Their goal was to bypass France's heavily fortified border by rushing a massive army straight through neutral Belgium, aiming to encircle Paris and knock the French out early. But invading a neutral country immediately triggered another treaty. Great Britain entered the conflict to defend Belgium. The German advance was forcefully halted before it could reach the French capital. Stalled outside Paris, both armies tried desperately to march around each other's flanks. They moved further and further north in a frantic race toward the coast, trying to find an open, undefended edge to attack. Neither side could break through. To survive the devastating volume of modern artillery falling around them, soldiers began digging directly into the earth. The result is what you see here, men living and fighting in deep, freezing trenches. Soon, an uninterrupted line of these defensive ditches stretched entirely from the English Channel down to the Swiss border. A grand military maneuver designed to secure a fast, sweeping victory directly engineered the exact opposite. Millions of men were now trapped in the most grueling, static defensive stalemate in military history. This photograph captures the lethal core of the conflict. Generals were still relying on 19th-century tactics, ordering waves of infantry to charge across open ground. But those men were charging directly into 20th-century machine gun fire and industrial artillery. To break the trench stalemate, armies rapidly escalated their arsenals. In 1915, at the Battle of Ypres, German forces released clouds of chlorine gas. Soldiers, like the ones in this image, had to quickly improvise rudimentary masks just to survive the chemical attacks. By 1916, the strategy grew even more grotesque. Look at this shattered landscape from Verdun. The German army attacked this fortress town not to gain ground, but purely to kill as many French soldiers as possible. They explicitly designed the battle as a mincing machine to bleed the French military until it collapsed. To relieve the intense pressure on Verdun, British and French forces launched their own massive attack at the Somme. It ended in absolute disaster. On the very first day of the offensive, 57,000 British soldiers became casualties as they tried to cross no man's land. The disconnect between tactics and technology turned the battlefield into an industrial process of elimination. Generations of young men were consumed for tiny increments of mud, yielding zero tangible gain for either side. Because the European front was completely deadlocked, the warring powers aggressively drained their global empires for resources. Fighting erupted thousands of miles away, pulling in African colonies, sparking battles over Middle Eastern oil, and drawing Japan into the Pacific. By 1917, the sheer strain broke one of the major powers. Facing staggering casualties and severe food shortages, Russia collapsed into revolution. The soldiers seen here joining the uprising ultimately helped knock their country out of the war entirely, giving Germany a real opening to win. To capitalize on that opening, Germany took a massive gamble. They deployed the vessels you see here, highly effective submarines known as U-boats. The plan was to torpedo any ship approaching Britain to completely starve the island's economy. This aggressive naval policy resulted in the sinking of passenger liners like the Lusitania, pictured here after an earlier incident. By targeting American vessels and simultaneously secretly encouraging Mexico to attack the United States, the German military infuriated the American public. The man in this portrait, President Woodrow Wilson, officially declared war shortly after. Germany's desperate attempt to cut off enemy supply lines backfired by waking a sleeping giant, bringing a tidal wave of fresh troops and endless industrial capacity to the Allied forces. Knowing that American reinforcements were arriving by the thousands every day, Germany launched one final frantic assault in the spring of 1918. They threw absolutely every resource they had left at the Allied lines to try and force a victory before their window closed. The offensive eventually stalled, and the pushback was immediate. The German army was exhausted, starving, and demoralized. Facing mutinies at home, the man pictured here, German Emperor Wilhelm II, abdicated his throne. By November of 1918, the fighting finally stopped. But the peace agreement signed by the men sitting around this table in the Hall of Mirrors was strictly punitive. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to take total blame for the entire conflict and pay heavy financial reparations. The victors then used this treaty to redraw the map. As we can see in this animation, centuries-old empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire were completely dismantled, carved up into new, arbitrary borders that still define Europe and the Middle East today. 16.5 million lives were lost. This total collapse of the old order serves as a permanent warning. When political structures become too rigid to adapt, a single spark can dismantle global stability in a matter of weeks.